Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the esoteric dimensions in the life and psychological theories of the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. With me today is Gary Lachman. Gary is the author of over 20 books on the intersection of esoteric culture and the Western intellectual tradition. These include biographies of Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, P.D. Ouspensky, Emanuel Swedenborg, Aleister Crowley, and many more. Among his books is Jung The Mystic, the esoteric dimensions of Carl Jung's life and teachings. And now we'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, once again, it's a pleasure to be here, Jeffrey.
We're going to be talking about really one of the most fascinating characters. I have had guests on my program who say that Carl Jung may be the most brilliant thinker of the 20th century.
Well, I'm sure he wouldn't argue with them that much, but yeah. No, he's certainly important one for me. That's true.
There are a number of people who would say that.
No, I thought absolutely. Freud wouldn't have been one of them, but you know.
Well, it's interesting because I think Freud and Jung are both contenders for, I would say, being in the top half dozen important thinkers of the 20th century.
I think it's true. I think during their lifetimes they were sort of like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, because Freud was the most famous psychologist in the world, and then Jung was the second most famous, and then when Freud died, he took that spot.
Well, the interesting thing, from my point of view, having sort of come up as a student of psychology, is that today in academia, both Freud and Jung are pretty much ignored. Certainly in psychology departments, maybe not so much in psychiatry.
I haven't been in academic context of psychology in years, but when I was in university a long time ago, I asked about that, and they said no. We don't. You might get him in a sort of comparative literature class. I mean, Freud actually, not really Jung at all. No, Jung's kind of, I guess he's been marginalized into the New Age alternative thought camp. Although when the Red Book was published, maybe about 10 years or so ago, I was surprised that it got a long review in the New York Times, because usually they didn't pay much attention to Jung at all.
And when I was an undergraduate in psychology back in 1969, I helped found the Psychology Student Association at the University of Wisconsin, big Midwestern school. And one of our demands at that time was that the university institute courses in Freud. We thought Freud was important, but Jung would have been even a bridge too far for us at that time. But we're going to focus today on the esoteric dimensions of Jung's work. That's probably why he was more marginalized even than Freud, and perhaps why he's by many people considered greater than Freud.
Well, I think certainly in, I say, the alternative world, and Freud, I guess his heyday was probably like the 20s and the 30s. And then by the 1940s and maybe into the 50s, he was sort of picked up in popular culture a great deal. I mean, because we watch a lot of films like Spellbound or some other films where they have like a Freudian background, and it was kind of like it explained lots of things. But Jung came into his own in the 1960s. He was, even the Beatles liked him. He was on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. So he's certainly sort of in the popular cultural world. I mean, the highbrow world and the mainstream intellectual world didn't really care for him very much. And there's all the business about him being associated with Nazi Germany and things of that sort, that it's all a very kind of muddled situation. And that didn't do well for him in the mainstream camp.
Well, since you bring it up, I think it's important to point out that you go quite far in your book to prove that Jung was very far from being a Nazi. If anything, he was an anti-Nazi.
Well, yeah, he certainly wasn't a Nazi, but I think he did make some injudicious statements at a time about sort of the racial unconscious and things of that sort that sadly, easily picked up and put to odious uses. And much like Nietzsche as well. I mean, Nietzsche wasn't alive at the time, but a lot of Nietzsche's ideas were picked up by Nazi ideologues and sort of used for their purposes. But if you actually go back to the sources, they argue against. And at some point, I mean, Jung was kind of on their hit list, and his books were being burned and things of that sort. So, he did make, and the whole sort of thing where he was involved with the journal of the psychological journal that had been taken over by the Nazi hacks, and he stayed on rather than cutting his relationships with them. He stayed on in order to have some Jewish psychologists have their work printed and things of that sort. So he's kind of like fighting on the right side, but in the wrong camp, as it were.
So both Freud and Jung were very important in the 20th century because they emphasized the role of the unconscious. I think they really showed that so much of our behavior that we think we're in conscious control and we've had the rational enlightenment and so on. Freud and Jung pointed out that largely we are being driven by behavioral patterns or archetypes or complexes of which we are not really conscious.
Oh, this is certainly it. I mean, much as Darwin didn't really discover evolution, but he managed to put the idea together in a nice package and communicate it clearly. Likewise with Freud, he didn't really discover the unconscious, but he put it together in a way that was communicated very clearly. And that was one of the main ideas, that yes, rational man, 18th century Enlightenment man who was, in control of his fate and all that. And this was something that both of them felt was a kind of hubris on modern man, and that, there were powers under the surface that were, if not absolutely in control, were certainly motivating us, but in ways that we didn't really understand. But I think there's a big difference between the two, because where Freud pretty much saw the unconscious as this kind of basement or kind of cellar where, a lot of stuff you didn't want, you threw down there. You didn't quite get rid of it, but you got it out of your conscious mind. So there wasn't really anything in the unconscious that wasn't first in consciousness, and you pushed it away down there. Whereas for Jung, it was a much different sort of thing. It was sort of the source and the matrix of consciousness. Consciousness rose out of this unconscious source, which for him was creative and productive and fundamentally positive.
Well, let's start by talking about Jung's childhood. I think it's very important to emphasize his relationship with his mother, who seemed to be an unusual person by all accounts.
Well, I mean, the whole idea of Jung as a mystic, or Jung having a sort of relationship to the occult, starts with his mother. His mother was someone who was very, very interested in spiritualism. She took part in seances, and she herself used to go into these strange kind of states where she seemed to become another person. She would speak in a different voice, and she would say things that were seemed deeply meaningful. Most of the time she wasn't like that. She was sort of, more or less regular housewife, housefrau. But she would slip into this other kind of state and turn into another personality. And this was something that Jung experienced himself when he was young. He had this kind of personality number two that he saw as sort of an 18th century kind of nobleman, and who was a much more masterful and powerful figure than who he was at the time, a young boy. And again, Jung, he plays, one of the reasons why I wrote my book about Jung was that he played his sort of occult cards very close to his chest for a great deal of his career. He didn't sort of want this to get out, and it's understandable. It would hurt his career, and it has, and it did. So it makes sense that he did that. But this is sort of stuff you have to kind of look for, and late in life when he did that oral biography, autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, it all kind of came out. But earlier than that, he didn't really. He wasn't that forthcoming with it. It was something that he kind of kept in the shadows.
And I think it's because he felt that his discoveries or his descriptions of what he called the collective unconscious and the archetypal processes and the importance of individuation, he regarded these as legitimate scientific discoveries.
Well, this is the thing. He's always saying, I'm not a mystic, but also I'm not an artist. I'm Herr Doctor Professor. I'm doing science here, and this is phenomenology. I'm just giving an empirical account of what I've discovered and things of that sort. And so he was constantly sort of hammering away at that. And it's sometimes it's sort of like the psychologist doth protest too much, because he sort of does it a little bit too much, and that made me suspect that, well, obviously there's something there that you're arguing against. You actually have a predilection for these sorts of things. And some schools of sort of renewed effort within the Jungian community to kind of get back to him and saying, yes, he did all this great work with sort of free association tests and things of that sort early days when he was at the Bergolzli clinic in Zurich. So he was doing kind of hard empirical, psychological science, but in the background, it was all this occult stuff there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's not so different, I think, from many people today who consider themselves psychical researchers or explorers of the esoteric. It's kind of, you walk a fine line between plunging into some sort of dark rabbit hole and doing real science. It seems as if there's a balance that needs to be struck. I think William James encountered that as well, and he came up with this notion of radical empiricism.
No, it's true, but I think in James's day there was a much more openness and tolerance for what we would call sort of parapsychology or sort of spiritualism and things of that sort, and mysticism. You had people like Henri Bergson, who was in his day as a famous intellectual as Freud or anyone like that, and he wrote openly about his interest in what we call the paranormal and things of that sort. Again, William James was another one. But today it's, you really get viciously attacked, or you can be viciously attacked by, the defenders of science, the Richard Dawkins types and all that, for having any kind of sympathy with this sort of thing. And if you're in the academic world, you tend to have to get tenure first before you can come out in the open and talk about these things. Or you don't take that route. You're an outsider like myself. I'm not associated with any university or academic standing, and I'm just kind of on my own, and you kind of do it yourself. But then often you just nobody pays attention to you because you're just some outsider writing books about this stuff.
Well, I suppose I'm in the same position as you in that regard.
Well, we're not alone. I think there's quite a few of us.
Well, but this issue of the significance of the paranormal in psychological theory is sort of the fulcrum that divided Freud and Jung. They argued over this. Well,
it's true. There's the famous story where the poltergeist in Freud's bookcase, when Jung is visiting Freud in Vienna, and they're having a conversation about the occult or paranormal and so on and so on, and basically Freud saying it's all rubbish, that kind of thing, and Jung is getting increasingly upset at this. He loves Freud. He wants to, he sees him as a kind of father figure and a mentor, but at the same time, he has his own ideas about these things, and he feels that Freud is just being too intolerant and too easily dismissive, and he's building up, and then suddenly there's a bang in the bookcase. And Freud kind of like, what was that? And Jung said, there's basically an exterior catalytic phenomena, which is his long-winded circumlocution for a poltergeist. And Freud says, no, it's tosh, it's just a coincidence. He said, no, sir, it was not, and there'll be another one now. And then bang, it happens again. And there's a description where he says Freud was aghast. And I always think of the cigar dropping out of his mouth and the eyebrows going up or something like that. And he was afraid of Jung. After that, he was afraid because he said, God, he can make these things happen. And right then and there, he was convinced that it really happened. But then when Jung went back to Zurich and then a little bit of time passed, he wrote him a letter saying, well, while you were here, you had me half convinced, but since then I've, thought about it and he can explain it and all this kind of thing. But I mean, Freud himself, believed in telepathy. He believed in all these things. I mean, he wrote papers on it. He carried out experiments with his daughter on it, but he didn't want it to be part of psychoanalysis, because in the early days of psychoanalysis, they were the occultists and spiritualists were sort of unwanted fellow travelers with the psychoanalysis there, because they were basically, working on the same terrain, the mind, the psyche, and all this hidden parts of the mind. And Freud even says that he got a lot of, letters, he got requests to write for some sort of spiritualists or, paranormal journals at the time, and he turned down his requests because he didn't want psychoanalysis being associated with it. But he actually, unofficially, believed in all that. And I mean, I wrote an article a while back for Freudian Times about how Freud was afraid of the occult because he believed in it, but he didn't want to admit that he believed in it, and he didn't want to actually. He felt if you admit that where do you stop? If you admit telepathy, if you admit that kind of thing happening, and he had more than one experience of what Jung would call synchronicity, and more than one experience of a kind of thought transfer between himself and one of his patients. But he was afraid of the kind of, that was like the thin edge of the wedge. You get that in, and then suddenly, everything goes. And so it was kind of like the pious lie. I mean, he wanted to maintain the sanctity and kind of the stability of psychoanalysis as an empirical science. And in order to do that, he had to say, okay, guys, we know this is true, but let's not talk about it.
Obviously, that wasn't enough for Jung, and Freud and Jung had a really serious breakup, and especially because Jung was regarded as the crown prince of the psychoanalytic movement at that time.
No, this is true. I mean, Freud was all ready for him to take over, and in the early days, Jung was kind of Freud's bulldog, as T.H. Huxley was considered for Darwin. He went to bat for Freud. He fought the good fight, and Jung was an enormously vital, creative individual, and he put all of his energy and all of his vitality into promoting psychoanalysis, editing journals, getting conferences together, arguing, taking on Freud's opponents and arguing them and all that. And Freud wanted him to inherit, the throne, as it were. One reason was that he wanted someone other than someone Jewish to take over, because it was increasingly his own circle in Vienna. Most of them were Jewish, and it was this kind of thing that the Nazis would say later on in the 30s, that Freud psychoanalysis, it's Jewish science. So he wanted a good Protestant like Jung, to an Aryan to take it over. And Jung was all ready to do it, but he was a genius himself. He had his own things to pursue. And the break came when he wrote his first major book, Symbols of Transformation. I think is the last way it was translated, the last title. And he kind of hides, there's the first few parts of it, he's more or less going along, standard Freudian kind of lines, but then you get to the incest theory kind of thing, and it's Jung can't stay with it anymore. The whole sort of sexual repression can't be the only source of neuroses and all that. Obviously it can be, and it is in many cases, but it's not the only one. And the incest sort of motif is an archetypal motif of a kind of return to the source, a return to the unconscious, rather than a literal, desire to sleep with your mother, that kind of thing. And that kind of finally comes out towards the end of the book. And he even says that it took him months and months and months to finish the book. He put off, finishing it because he knew this would make the break. And that's exactly what happened.
Now, another important aspect of Jung's development, I think, is his reaction or rebellion against his father, who was a Protestant minister, along with several uncles.
Yeah, I mean, again, like there's many parallels with Nietzsche as well, and the Jungian psychologist Anthony Storr, who's written a British psychologist, written quite a bit about Jung. He brings this out in many of the things he's written, where, yes, I mean, they both came from families where, the father and many of the male figures in the family were in the church. And the thing with Jung's father is that he wouldn't discuss any of these issues. I mean, it was just something he accepted. This is what he did, and he accepted the faith on, just took it at face value. And Jung was one of these individuals, and he was very religious. He had a strong religious sense and a strong sense of actually the living God, But his father wouldn't answer. He wouldn't talk with any of this sort of thing at all. And he kind of felt that his father had just sort of cut himself off from any of that kind of thing. His mother was much more open to these sorts of things, so because of her interest and her sort of pursuit of spiritualism and that kind of stuff. I don't think his father wasn't really interested in that kind of thing. He didn't partake in the seances and things of that sort.
And speaking of Jung's mother, I gather from your book that the sense is that her side of the family was either touched with psychic gifts or psychological disturbances, or, as is often the case, both.
You could say all the strange stuff came from his mother's side of the family, and there were a couple famous accounts of sort of poltergeist or strange activity. There was the one where it was a big dining room sort of table, and they were in another room, and they suddenly heard this big crack, and they go in and they see this oak table had cracked against the seam. It wasn't like along the seam, and then it wasn't as if, oh well, it was just the wood drying because it was old already and the wood was all dry and all this kind of stuff. And then another one was there was a knife that again was a similar, like a bang, a kind of bang sound. And Jung was looking around to see what it could have been, and inside a cupboard there was a carving knife that had broken into discrete pieces, and he took it to a cutler, and then the fellow said, well, the only way you could have done this was like put it in a vice and kind of do it purposely crack the kind of thing. And he sent that to J.B. Rhine. He sent that the remnants of the knife to the famous parapsychological researcher J.B. Rhine at Duke University. So yeah, I mean, and again, his first his sort of thesis, the psychology of so-called occult phenomena. It's an account of his experiences studying a medium in seances, but he doesn't say that it's his cousin. It's a cousin of his that so it was all in the family, but he keeps a discrete distance from it. And again, this is something that only came out sort of later on. So he didn't. He wanted to study these things scientifically, but he didn't want to show that he was, really involved in it himself. I guess the idea that this would appear to sort of prejudice him in its favor.
Mm-hmm. And now you're talking about his doctoral dissertation, I presume, for his medical degree.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was it. So that was like his kind of entree into the world was about that. And again, it wasn't unusual because you've said William James, other people were studying these kinds of things. There's a wonderful book called The Discovery of the Unconscious by Henri Ellenberger. And it's basically the history of how we've come to understand the unconscious, and then it arises out of many ways out of sort of spiritualism. It arises out of people like Swedenborg and Mesmer and people like that in the study of animal magnetism. And, where we have the word mesmerize, but we use it as a kind of alternative to hypnotize. But in actual Mesmer's day, he believed there was some real kind of fluid, some kind of physical kind of thing that he was able to project onto his patients, and it was through that he was curing them. But it later turned out that actually he was putting them into these trances, and the cure was come out of that. But one of his disciples, basically clicked that there wasn't anything to do with any kind of magnetism, any kind of magnetic rays coming out of Mesmer's figures. It was somehow the passes were putting the patient into this trance, and then the patient's conscious mind would be asleep, but his unconscious mind would be awake and would respond to questions put to him, and also was able to do things that he couldn't do when he was conscious. And so this again, so there you go, kind of opening into the unconscious there. And I think both Freud and Jung, I think Freud more than Jung, they sort of delved into using hypnotism for a while, and then they kind of, I guess, when they developed the dream theory and that kind of thing, the free association, they didn't use it as much.
Well, I think if we look at the historical context of both Freud and Jung, you have a situation in which spiritualism and mesmerism are widely spread in the population. There are numerous reports everywhere of paranormal activities associated with these things. And at the same time, 19th century materialism is really strong, and you have many leaders in the academic scientific community saying this is all nonsense and superstition, and I don't care how many people testify to it, it's not true.
Well, that's the same thing today. I mean, you know, it's, it's the same sort of thing today where no matter how many accounts you can come up with, they'll say, oh, that's just anecdotal. And I mean, the thing is, I think many people have realized that these sorts of phenomena, they're not, they don't really like the kind of laboratory setting because they're not something you can just kind of turn on and off, and they have much to do with, you know, the psychology of the person involved, the context, their emotional state, and all that sort of thing. And so they're more kind of attuned to our emotional sorts of states than to some kind of, you know, power that you, oh, okay, I can turn it on and off. Not to say that people don't exhibit it in kind of laboratory conditions, but they're not the best conditions for that. So you're trying to study something under conditions in which it will, you know, it isn't as likely to appear as it will in these other kinds of ones. Same thing like sort of with, you know, UFO sightings and things of that sort. You know, these sorts of things happen within a particular context, and they're not necessarily going to happen when you take it out of that context and you try to devise, you know, the proper scientific, you know, contextualization in order to, you know, get rid of bias and all that kind of stuff. And so it's understandable that, okay, the ones who want to stick to this very hard way of looking at it, they'll just, well, it can't meet this criteria, so it mustn't exist. And that was basically, you know, what was happening with 19th century materialism into the 20th century. It had a very narrow, rigorous set of criteria that phenomena had to meet in order to, you know, be credited with being true, and not many things could. You know, the things that could did, but the other things, and many of the things that couldn't, were the things that are most important to us. I mean, you can't test love in a laboratory, or beauty, or meaning, or value, and all these kinds of things. And so all those things were called subjective, and the real things were, you know, little billiard balls, you know, atoms hitting each other and making us feel like that. And so I think more and more today we realize that this doesn't work, but still there's a hardcore, you know, sensibility in this kind of, whatever you want, scientistic kind of world where it doesn't allow for that.
Now, Jung was really propelled into a deep, I'm going to call him a psychonaut, because he went deeply into his own mind, almost as if he were using psychedelic drugs, although there's no evidence, I think, that he did. But his explorations were, I think, prompted to a large degree by the emotional trauma triggered by his breakup with Freud.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he certainly had a nervous breakdown, or however you want to call it. I mean, depending how generous you want to talk about what he went through. I mean, some critics of him just say he just had a psychotic episode, you know, or a psychotic breakdown for a long time. But yeah, I mean, and again, this wasn't that unfamiliar within Freud's circle. I mean, two of Freud's followers who were rejected by him committed suicide. A fellow named Herbert Silverer, who actually wrote about alchemy and psychology before Jung did. And he also wrote a paper about hypnagogia, the in-between state of sleeping and waking, that Jung read and I'm sure influenced what he later developed as active imagination. And another fellow named Victor Tausk, he committed suicide. And then you have Wilhelm Reich, had a breakdown when Freud kicked him out later. So it was a really traumatic experience to be thrown out of Freud's circle. And Jung, I mean, Jung, when Freud rejected him, he was not only rejected by Freud, he was rejected by the whole psychoanalytical community. Then, you know, he was a renegade and all that, and so he was, you know, black sheep, you know, he persona non grata. And he plunged into this madness. I mean, he talks about fighting off the madness for, you know, for months and months and months. And he slept with a loaded revolver under his pillow, and, you know, he'd blow his brains out when the madness got too great. And his descent in the unconscious, or what he calls his night sea journey, started when he decided, well, okay, I'm not going to fight it off anymore. Let's see what happens when I let go. And that's when he, plunged into the world of the archetypes and collective unconscious and started to produce what we know as the Red Book.
And I guess the Red Book, which was only published about 10 years ago and is a complete documentation of what he went through. This episode in his life was almost entirely unknown until the publication of the Red Book.
Yeah, I mean, it came out in bits and pieces. He talks about it in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and in some of his lectures, and in some of his writings on mandala and things of that sort. He has some examples of mandalas, and he'll say it's a patient, but it's actually him, doing it. And he himself didn't know what to make of it. There's a section of it known as the Seven Sermons to the Dead. And this was again, you talk about psychic experiences. I mean, Jung was fascinated with the dead, and he spoke with the dead. They came to him. He had dreams about, tombs opening up as he walked down, an avenue and things of that sort. And this one particular episode, there was this incredible psychic tension in his house in Kusnacht on Lake Zurich. And, the children were affected by it as well, and there were noises and bangings and all this kind of thing, and suddenly there was like, a kind of bang at the door, and he opened it, and it was like we are the dead, and we went to Jerusalem and we did not find what we sought. I'm paraphrasing it, and they came to him. And it's written in this kind of Nietzschean, Zarathustra kind of mock biblical kind of language that it depends how generous you want to be. I mean, Jung himself said this is the way the archetypes speak. They spoke in this kind of really bombastic kind of language, but it's so he published that, and he sent copies to people like Hermann Hesse and others, and he didn't quite know what to make of it. And the other thing too is if you look at the Red Book, I mean, Jung went on and on of how he wasn't an artist. He was discovering these things. He wasn't creating them. But all you have to do is look at a few pages of the Red Book, and you see, well, along with everything else you are, Carl, you're obviously an artist, because you have these wonderful watercolors, page after page after page, and then the script is in this wonderful, calligraphy. It's an illuminated manuscript. But he tells the story that he sort of rejected the idea. His anima was suggesting to him that this was art, and no, I'm a scientist, and all that kind of thing. But again, it doesn't. I personally don't care whether he's a scientist or not. What he came up with is fascinating, and is actually, tells us a lot about our inner world. So, for his own career, I think he felt like he needed to emphasize that. But I don't think it's necessary to appreciate, what he's given us.
Well, you point out that the origin of many of his later theories came out of that plunge he took into the depths of his own psyche.
Well, that's what he said at Memories, Dreams, and Reflection. He said everything I developed, later on, my whole psychology came from these experiences. And he tells the story of how he finally stops trying to fight off the madness. He lets himself plunge, and he finds himself in this dark kind of underworld, and it's like he's walking through a stream, and he sees a giant scarab, and then this kind of a young man's head, and all these variety of different sorts of. I mean, and then leading up to that, he had what led him to think that he was going insane. He had all these sort of waking dreams where he would suddenly find himself in a visionary state, and he tells the story of when he's on the train. I think it's between Zurich and Schaffenhausen or somewhere like that. And he looks out the window on the train, and he has this vision of like a tidal wave, coming across the continent, and it's just, debris and destruction and all this sort of thing. And this happens quite a few times. And he's actually relieved, ironically, he's relieved later on when he realizes, oh no, this is not about me going insane, because this was just before the start of World War I. So World War I starts, and so he was kind of having a precognitive vision of that happening. And he wasn't alone. There were actually quite a few other people at the time, the same thing happening to them. But when he when he stopped fighting off the madness and he plunged, he found himself within his psyche, as it were. And he had encounters with entities, beings that lived there. One was Elijah, Salome from the Bible, and one of the the one that he writes about quite a bit was with the character that he later called his inner guru, that he named Philemon, and he was a bearded character with wings. And what Philemon told him is that your problem is that you think your thoughts are yours. You think you own your thoughts, but you don't. Your thoughts are like the animals and the plants in the forest, and you are one of those animals and plants in the forest. You share this inner forest with them as well. And there's a phrase that I prefer to the collective unconscious. He talks about the objective psyche, which means there are things in our mind that have nothing to do with us personally. They're not about, there's our personal unconscious, is kind of like the first level, and then when you get deeper, you enter this other. It's collective in the sense that we all share it, but it's not like one mind kind of thing. I think that's one of the problems with the collective unconscious, is sort of the sense that we're all one mind, and it's not quite what he means. He means something that's available and shared by all of us. But it's objective. It's not about me personally. It's this other dimension of reality that I can enter into, through my mind.
I'm under the impression that this is sort of what William James was also getting at when he wrote about a pluralistic universe.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, I think quite a few have had similar experience. Aldous Huxley talked about mind at large. Was another kind of phrase. It's not, again, the visions you have tend to be personalized. So Emanuel Swedenborg, he too entered into these deeper realms. I mean, in fact, Swedenborg's dream diaries predate, Jung and Freud by, a good almost 2 centuries. And they're absolutely fascinating. And his interpretation of his dreams are, precursors in many ways to what they were doing. And he said that we enter into the spiritual realms through our own minds first, but he went to heaven and hell. But that was kind of the context that he worked in. That was sort of the mythic language that he had, or the angels took him. He also went to other planets. Or Rudolf Steiner read the Akashic record, and he was sort of working within this theosophical kind of narrative. And then you have people like Henri Corbin, who knew Jung and who participated in the Eranos conferences in Switzerland. And he was working in this sort of Persian mystical context. So in a way, it's the same terrain, but it appears to each of us differently because of our own kind of personal context in which we enter it.
Now, since you bring up Rudolf Steiner, I think it's interesting. He and Jung were both in Switzerland, I believe, at the same time. As I recall, Steiner wanted to cultivate some kind of a connection with Jung, and Jung would have nothing to do with him, much in the way that Freud rejected Jung. Jung was rejecting Steiner.
Jung talks about how one of his students, or a follower of his, gave him some of Steiner's books to read, and he read them, and he said, this man belongs in an asylum, or something like that. So he was basically saying, Steiner was crazy. And I think I'm sure Steiner would have, liked to have met him, and would have been very, cordial and civil and had a conversation. But he didn't like the idea of the unconscious. Steiner's thing was that, everything should be conscious. Everything should be conscious mind. That's what he talks about. His way of reading the Akashic record was different than Madame Blavatsky. She went into a trance state, and she sort of gave up her ego and was taken over by these powers. But he wanted to be a conscious explorer in them, so he developed a kind of rigorous mental process while you could enter what they have in common, all three of these, Jung, Steiner, Swedenborg, is that they were all practiced hypnagogists. I mentioned hypnagogia before, and I briefly mentioned Herbert Silberer. All three of them were very adept at entering this kind of in-between state. Apparently Swedenborg could stay in it for hours on end, and that's when he went on his journeys to heaven and hell. But all three of them were able to enter into this kind of state. And it's a strange state where you can get both sort of dream material comes up, sort of fantasy material, but at the same time it can be actual cognitive, where you're actually learning something true. And I guess the difficult thing is to discriminate between the two. So they were, again, and Henri Corbin, he when he's talking about how best to try to enter into these sort of states, he says, well, we really need to explore this in-between state between sleeping and waking. So that seems to be kind of the royal road, as it were, into this deeper parts of the mind, and you can watch the unconscious at work. And one of the things that Silberer discovered was that the images and the voices, because it's auditory as well, they're self-symbolic. They're symbolic of either your mental state, your emotional state, or your physical state, or something you were thinking about at the time. So it's a kind of reflection back onto your own processes, and you can see that happening in Jung, certainly, because he sees the unconscious as an intelligent entity of some kind that makes intelligent comments about our lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, you spoke earlier about Jung's vision while he was riding a train where he saw Europe just sort of flooded with blood. And he thought initially this was something having to do with his own personal psychological dynamics. And after carefully examining himself, he eventually concluded, no, it was a precognitive vision of what was about to emerge in Europe. I know later on, in I think about 1933, he published an essay in which he predicted the Second World War because he noticed images of the German war god Wotan sort of rising up in the dreams of his German patients. And he felt that this was a significant sign that the archetype of the war god was emerging in the German psyche.
Well, certainly, yeah, that's what he said had happened with Nazi Germany. This is how Hitler came to power so remarkably, was that he was basically writing the archetype. He was kind of the voice for the archetype, and the archetype was taking over. And this was the blonde beast. Nietzsche talked about that as well. And I guess Jung was saying that what had happened is that the German soul, and again, this is where he gets into touchy territory, because he talks about the German soul is younger than the Aryan soul is younger than the Jewish soul, and all this kind of thing. And it wasn't the best time to talk about those kinds of things. But again, he was saying, well, I'm just doing science here. This has got nothing to do with politics. This is just pure science. But it hadn't been tamed. You know, it wasn't tamed. It wasn't Christianized. Christianity had just basically pushed a lot of that stuff aside, and it was building up, and eventually would have to be released. And the sort of thing that if you don't make a place or a way for the unconscious, the archetypes to come out consciously, creatively, where you participate with them, they're going to come out anyway. And it's not always nice the way they come out. You know, they erupt, and this is what he was saying was what happened in Nazi Germany, where the ancient god of Wotan had come back, just hammer and tongs, as it were, and took over. Although I think he got, again, some people sort of criticized him for saying, like, oh, well, that kind of lets everybody off the hook. You should kind of say the archetype made me do it. I'm not personally responsible for, joining the party and whatever it is you did. The archetypes did it, that kind of thing. But that's not really what he was saying. But he was trying to understand. And Jung had it later on, when he wrote, towards the end of his life, when he wrote about UFOs. He saw the UFO phenomena. It had started, depending on who you look at it, this is something that's been throughout human history in different forms. But in the modern context, it starts in the late 40s. But the flying saucers were these kind of mandalas from outer space. They were sort of visionary projections of the unconscious, trying to rectify the schizoid split that had happened with the Cold War, with the America and Russia getting ready to go to nuclear war then, and somehow, so the collective mind was projecting these kind of images of wholeness out there. So Jung always had a feeling that, these archetypes work on large scale kind of historical sorts of things, and he, towards the end of his life, he's talking about the age of Aquarius and things of that sort.
I suppose we really need to touch on the theory of synchronicity as well, because when it comes to esoteric culture, that may be Jung's major contribution.
Well, certainly, he certainly coined a useful term for what we, usually think of as meaningful coincidence, where, the simplest way for me to understand synchronicity, there's something going on in your head and something going out on the outside world, and they're related through meaning. They have an indubitable, immediate, and powerful kind of impact on you. And it's as if, who knows that I'm thinking this, and how could they possibly put that, precisely the right thing right there at the time for me to experience it. But Jung, it kind of becomes a one-size-fits-all term for Jung to sort of explain all paranormal, kind of phenomena. And he did that book with Wolfgang Pauli, and Pauli himself was someone, synchronicities happened around all the time, and there's the whole story about the Pauli effect, where he would and he was a deeply troubled individual, and he would come into laboratories, and the beakers would explode and things like that, and there were even people, when they knew he was coming, they would close down the lab or something, so he didn't walk through and break anything. But no, Jung was, again, he was trying to give a scientific basis for something that we've all experienced it in our lives, and people have recorded it before then. I mean, one of the things that I've, since reading Jung, and I have notebooks full of these synchronicities where they just happen, and you can't. I mean, you can talk about quantum physics as much as you want. I just don't understand how that may be the physical medium by which these things can take place, but the meaningful aspect of it is something that's very, very different. And that's what. I think that's the thing that distinguishes some radical coincidence to a synchronicity, because it always seems to have some kind of meaning content for you. It's a commentary, just like dreams are a commentary on your life. The synchronicities are a commentary as well.
Well, and it's been a very influential concept. Jung also suggested that the principle behind synchronicities was also responsible for the success of divination systems like the I Ching, and I suppose he would extend that to astrology as well.
Yeah, well, I think behind it is his idea of the unus mundus, like the one world. So, I mean, in one sense, everything is a symbol of everything else. If you know how to read it, you take a cup, and the rest of the universe kind of expands from that cup. And if you know how to read it, you can see the meanings of other things there. And yes, this was something. Again, this goes back. He traces it back to Neoplatonism and the whole idea of anima mundi, and it's kind of the soul of the world. That this. What do you want to call it? This kind of connection that everything has, connected to everything else. This kind of living world. And you can start to see experience as something to be read. And this is something that's interesting to me, because it moves away from the scientific, not to say we shouldn't do this, but the scientific way of looking at this to more of a narrative kind of way. There's a story there. So rather than like, oh, what makes this tick? Where is this story going? What's the meaning of this tale now? So you can, this takes us back to Kabbalah, a variety of different esoteric ways of looking at the world, where it's speaking to us in some way, or all the phenomena speaking to us in some way. And synchronicity is a way you can read that, and it's telling you something, rather than what's the stuff or the mechanism that's making this happen? And you can say, well, actually, what is it trying to tell me? And this is something that people of an earlier time had more, felt more attuned with, and with the rise of, rationality and all of that in the late 17th century and all that, we kind of put that out of the way as superstition. But it doesn't go away. It's there. It's part of us.
I think one of Jung's most important books is Modern Man in Search of a Soul, where he really complains about the sterileness of modern life in terms of people being out of touch with their inner depths.
Well, this is it. I mean, modern man, in order to achieve the kind of mastery of if that's what you want to call it, of the planet that we have, we had to sort of put that other way of being in the world aside. We had to marginalize it. In order to understand the laws of planetary motion, we had to kick the angels off the stars, and that, I would say, and Jung himself, even though he goes on about the great hubris of rational man and all that, he'll say, but we don't want to jettison that. We need science and we need all that. That's part of us, but we need to bring in the other as well. That's one. And I don't know if you know the film The Petrified Forest, an early film with Humphrey Bogart, but one of the characters in that is he's sort of wandering out in the desert, and he has a copy of Modern Man in Search of the Soul with him. So that's a very early kind of appearance of Jung in popular culture. He wasn't quite, and this is a film from the 30s, he wasn't quite as part of that kind of scene then as well. But this is something he felt a great modern man, Enlightenment man, rational man, for all his achievements, there was a great hubris, where we basically think as you said earlier, we think we're the complete masters of ourselves, but there are other forces, other powers that we can reach an arrangement with. And if we don't do that, then they will be just pushing us around. I mean, that was the whole idea. We can reach an arrangement with them and actively participate with them. But if you don't do that, they're going to come and do what they need to do anyway.
Well, it was to me an important book in my own growth. Actually, many of Jung's books have been. Another really crucial book of his, I think, is called, I hope I pronounce this correctly, Aeon, in which he takes the ages of astrology and endeavors to apply them to the development of eras of civilization.
Yeah, I mean, he takes the notion of the precession of the equinoxes. We have, this is, again, bringing us to the age of Aquarius, which, depending on what system you use, is, we're either in it already or it's about to come or something like that. And that was preceded by the age of Pisces and I think it was Taurus before then, and so on and so on. And he lines up the archetypes. So he kind of talks about the precession of the archetypes. And so where there's changes in the Platonic year, but there's also changes in the inner astronomy, you could say. And Jung was he was very much a devotee of astrology. He talks about how he either did the chart himself of some of his patients or he had them done. And again, that's a synchronistic phenomena. It's not so much that the stars are actually position of the stars are making things happen, but there's parallels between them, between your character and them, and you can, if you know how to read them, you can learn something about that. But yeah, this is where he's talking about, again, I forget exactly when that book came out, but it's a later book. But even as early as the 40s, in letters, he's talking about the age of Aquarius and that kind of thing. And he kind of comes out in the open in that book too, where he's saying how there are changes taking place in the psyche that seem to indicate, a massive change in human history and all that sort of thing. And again, I mentioned the UFO book was another example of that.
So you imply in your book that the great burgeoning of what we might call New Age culture in the 1960s, the human potential movement, and sort of an occult explosion of that you've written about in some of your other earlier books, that Jung was very much a precursor of and an anticipator of that whole development.
Well, I think he was certainly talking about it before it became, very, very popular. And when the occult revival in the 1960s happened, got going in the early 60s, but by the mid-60s, the most famous people in the world, the Beatles, were deep into it. He was someone everyone was referring to. The I Ching became, that edition of Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, with Jung's introduction, that became something that everyone had. And he also, he helped introduce the variety of different Eastern teachings, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He wrote about D.T. Suzuki's books on Zen and things of that. And the Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a Chinese alchemical text. And in his introduction to that, that's one of the places where he talks most clearly about his practice of active imagination, where you consciously start a kind of dialogue with the unconscious. And so, no, he was very much, someone who was, and again, he's writing about flying saucers. So he was certainly someone who was, although his standing in the academic world wasn't as, prestigious as Freud's, I'd say, or other, by that time, other psychologists, he was certainly considered to be, an important intellectual figure. And so he was kind of giving his imprimatur on these things that had been marginalized. And again, he may not have been picked up by all the mainstream intellectuals, but the grassroots, popular culture certainly picked up on it.
I'm particularly impressed by the work he did with Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel laureate physicist. Pauli was using his own dreams to explore the very significant philosophical question of the mind-matter interaction, and his dreams revealed to him some what I think of as some rather profound answers to that mystery.
Well, this was something that Jung labored at too, he talked about something that was psychoid. that had a psychic side to it, but also a physical side, and there was some way in which it participated in both things. And this is something we find difficult to grasp or to conceptualize, because certainly since Descartes, where Descartes talks about there basically mental things and physical things out there, and he and other people, Swedenborg, they're always trying to find, well, where's the place where they meet? They seem radically different, but where do they come together, and how do you get one from the other? Okay, neurons are associated with thought, but a thought and a neuron isn't the same thing, and so it's sort of how we conceptualize it may be more of the problem, and actually trying to find some way to some borderline where they both come together. But synchronicity would be something where you have a mental or a psychic kind of process that exteriorized it expressed itself in a outer physical kind of way. And it certainly jumps the fence between both of these kinds of places. And I guess too, this is something quantum physics come in that, because the more and more you go into deeper into matter, it isn't matter anymore. The whole 19th century idea of little tiny billiard balls banging against each other as atoms. Well, that went out the window with with quantum and all that, and suddenly it's nothing like anything. You can't even visualize it in any way. We make nice little pictures of it in order for us to understand it, but when you get down to the actual level, it's not like that at all, and it becomes something that's much more like thought. I mean, even earlier, someone like I think James Jeans in the early 20th century, he was saying the stuff of the universe seems to be much more of a mental stuff than any kind of physical kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think he said the universe is more like a great story than a great mechanism.
Well, there you go. I mean, that to me is seems a fruitful way to look at it, and that takes us back to much earlier mythical kinds of way.
Well, before we conclude our discussion about Jung, I guess we ought to also point out that he went to great lengths to try to integrate esoteric thinking into psychology by emphasizing Gnosticism and alchemy.
He says he was trying to find a historical parallel to what he was doing. He somehow felt that if he's come across this, there must be examples of it in the past. And the first thing he tried to find a connection with was Gnosticism. And for some reason that didn't work for him. He says it was too difficult to make the connection. But then, it was the synchronicity itself that took place when he turned his mind towards alchemy, because he was sent this book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, which Wilhelm had translated as a Chinese alchemical text, and he sent it to Jung, and Jung said this arrived at the same moment that I was just starting to think about alchemy as a way to enter into this. And what he fundamentally says is the alchemists were doing what he called active imagination, but they didn't know that's what they were doing, and so they were projecting unconscious processes out into the physical matter they were dealing with and the operations they were dealing with, and all of the strange language and symbols and iconography and images that the alchemists worked with were expressions of these unconscious processes that they were sort of projecting out. And I mean, people that practice actually hard alchemy, they say, well, no, it's actually it has something to do with the real physical stuff. It isn't just a projection and all that. So I think there's he got a lot of criticism from that, and there are two camps, and again, you can see, well, isn't that an example of this trying to bridge the matter-mind kind of boundary? Because there's some Jungian thinkers about alchemy are saying, no, it's a projection of the unconscious mind onto this stuff, and you have the alchemists saying, no, it's got nothing to do with that. It's real, transformations taking place in matter. Well, again, they seem to be on opposite sides of this thing that Jung was trying to bridge over. But that's fundamentally what he said, is that they were engaging in this practice where they were developing a dialogue with the unconscious, but they were using the language of physical matter, and also it was a Christian language, because many of the alchemists were very devout Christians and all that.
And I suppose we ought to bring up the fact that in our earlier discussion of the Hermetic tradition, we pointed out that alchemy really was closely associated with that tradition, which did have a lot to do with exploring the evolution of the soul itself.
It's true. It's true. I mean, it's a kind of later development. I mean, one of the things is there isn't any mention of alchemy in what's known as the Corpus Hermeticum. I mean, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, which is probably the most famous alchemical tract. It's not part of this collection of texts from sort of the second century in the Christian era. That is, sort of the fundamental basis for the Hermetic teaching. It's something that comes up 6th, 7th century later, and there's no Greek original ever found. So it's not to say there weren't alchemy was around at the same time and they knew of each other, but it didn't sort of take on. It didn't take on sort of the prestige of being the Hermetic art. Until later on, and then it was like retranslated back into Europe in the Middle Ages and that kind of thing. So, the early Hermetic teaching is much more about something that we call cosmic consciousness. It was something about. Although I was surprised, and I gave a talk about this quite some time ago, that Jung actually didn't sort of see the Hermetic journey through the planets, which is similarly the Gnostics did this as well. To get back to the source. You have to journey back through the planets, and there's certainly a way you can read that as similarly to getting, to the unconscious and going through the same kind of processes. And he doesn't seem to have seen that was there, and I found that a little surprising.
Well, Gary Lachman, this has been a fascinating discussion as always. We've covered a lot of ground. I know Jung's work is so rich and complex and ongoing. It's really a living tradition with many modern interpreters as well. We we could talk on and on and on for years about Jung, but I think this has been a very good overview, so especially of the mystical side. So thank you very much for being with me.
Well, absolutely, my pleasure. And you're right. I mean, one conversation can't cover can only cover a fraction of Jung's ideas, and so I'm glad that we had an opportunity to do that.
I think this was a very credible look at this side of Jung's work, Gary. Once again, thank you.